In the name of God, who creates us, who redeems us, and whoever gives us life. Amen. My first encounter with worship was with the nighttime prayers with my parents. The three of us would kneel beside my bed, and they taught me the words of my first prayer. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Now, I don't think I really thought about these words, because if I had, the words probably would have disturbed me a bit. But the words and the ritual was sort of a blanket that made me feel safe and warm. What I remember is Mama and Daddy and me kneeling there and saying the rhyme and the rhythm of the words. And at the end of that, then I would add my own thanksgivings. I would thank God for Mommy and Daddy and my teddy bear and whatever else crossed my mind that I was thankful for that day. And as I got older, then they taught me the Lord's Prayer, that I would still add my own series of thanksgivings at the end of that. And then even as I got a little bit older, I still would go in and kneel beside my parents' bed and pray the Lord's Prayer. That early experience of prayer and worship helped form my religious life and my values. In times of disruption and change, worship is the foundation stone to which we return to rebuild what has fallen apart in the world and in our own lives. That was true for Zechariah, some 500 years before Jesus' time. It was a crucial time in both Jewish history and in his own life. In 587 BC, the Babylonian Empire came in and sacked Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and took off to Babylon most of the elite there in Jerusalem. That captivity lasted for some 50 years. Zechariah's father, who was a priest there at the temple before it was destroyed, of course, was one of the people who was taken off in captivity to Babylon. But even in crisis and captivity, they still worshiped and prayed, even if it was just at the dinner table that they sat around and had meals. We don't know the details of the Jewish family life and their practices during this time, but it was during this time that so much of the Jewish religious life and understanding of who they were came into form, and so many of the rituals that Jews nowadays even practice were formed and started during this time. It was during this disruptive time that Zechariah was born and was raised in this home, and those practices formed, like it did mine, his own future. When the Babylonian Empire was conquered by the Persians, then the Persians said, okay, everybody who wants to go back to their home country can go back to their home country. And so those who wanted to did go. Zechariah, who by this time was a priest himself, went to Jerusalem, even though he had never been to Jerusalem before. He was really a citizen of Babylon. But he went back and joined with others to rebuild the nation and the religion. And they rebuilt the temple, but it was not quite like Solomon's grand temple, and the people were dissatisfied and discouraged and with very little energy for the future. And so that became Zechariah's mission, to bring hope for a new and renewed future built on the foundation of worship. Now, I told you the story about my own learning to worship, and I told you the story of how worship was central in Zechariah's life. But now I want you to hear in his own words the importance of worship. And so what you might do is look back at the text of the Old Testament reading from Zechariah today. The text is in poetic form, as was much of the Jewish writing about this time, as evidenced by the Psalms that were all sort of in poetic fashion, as is much of the writing of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Poetry is not explanation or information that speaks to the mind and reason. Poetry is the language that speaks to the imagination, that speaks to the heart, that speaks to the soul. This poem begins with an invitation to rejoice. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. You notice that so many of the Psalms and so much of the Jewish poetry are repetitive lines, just using different language. Zion being another word for Jerusalem. But what are they called to rejoice? Well, they are rejoicing because they are getting a new king in Jerusalem for the first time in 3 generations. But Zechariah has this image of a new kind of king, not the triumphant warrior king that's in the model of David, who's going to restore Jerusalem to its might and power, but a new kind of king, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Now, donkeys originally were the transportation of kings. If you remember in the book of Samuel, when David comes into Jerusalem, he comes in riding a donkey. But by this time, donkeys were a beast of burden, a humble ride. It was the horse that exuded power and might, that was the ride of kings. But Zechariah's king was going to come in riding a donkey. No wonder the writers of the gospel picked up on this imagery of Jesus coming into Jerusalem riding on a donkey. They use these same words in the readings that we use for Palm Sunday. But this king also was going to do different things. He was going to cut off the chariot from Ephraim, the northern kingdom, and the war horse. Remember the contrast, the war horse from the donkey, from Jerusalem, the southern kingdom. And he will do away with the tools of war and bring peace to the nations. The nations meaning everybody who was non-Jewish, So we bring peace to the whole world, from the sea to the ends of the earth. This is a universal image that he has. Now, I want you to think of this as liturgical language said in worship, as a prayer or a vision, a hope of what things would be. And if this is a prayer, then God responds. And these are the words that God responds in. As for you, God speaking to the people there, as for you, because of the history of our relationship, your prisoners will be free. Notice the future tense. Your prisoners will be free. And then the concluding line. So return to your stronghold, O prisoners of hope. The present tense. You're still a prisoner, but you are a prisoner of hope. But if you return to that stronghold, then you will be free. So what is that stronghold? You might want to take this passage home with you and to think about it during this week and to look at it. What is that stronghold? I think it's worship. We express our hope for a new and different future, especially in times of change and disruption in worship. Worship is at the heart of what forms our spiritual lives and our religious actions in the world. St. John's has been going through a struggle with worship, coming back from COVID, of whether we keep on doing things the way we've been doing it post-COVID, or whether we go back to the way things were prior to COVID. It's a new day and a challenge to recommit ourselves to our corporate worship. Sarah's words explaining this several weeks ago said our new worship schedule in the fall is important here. Changes have become the new way. We're also returning to what is beloved and familiar. May we never lose sight of the grace of God in the midst of change as we continually to faithfully build community at the crossroads of faith and life. May we never lose sight of the grace of God in the midst of change as we continually to faithfully build community at the crossroads of faith and life. Amen.